Hi everyone, I'm Taylen Baumgardner and I'm the Chief Community Officer and Vice President of Digital Operations for Generation Connection. Today we will be covering the Roaring Twenties, so let's get started. The Roaring Twenties was a period in history of dramatic social and political change. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than on farms. The nation's total wealth doubled between 1920 and 1929. And this economic growth swept many Americans into an unfamiliar consumer society. People from coast to coast brought the same goods, listened to the same music, did the same dances, and used the same slang. Many Americans were uncomfortable with this new, urban, sometimes racy mass culture. In fact, for many, even most people in the United States, the 1920s brought more conflict than celebration. However, for a small handful of young people in the big cities, the 1920s were roaring indeed. The most familiar symbol of the Roaring Twenties is probably the flapper, a young woman with bobbled hair and short skirts who drank, smoked, and said they might be termed unladylike things, in addition to being more sexually free than previous generations. In reality, most young women in the 1920s did none of these things, but even though those women who were not flappers, they gained some unprecedented freedoms. They could vote at last. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution had guaranteed that right in 1920, though it would be decades before African American women in the South could fully exercise their right to vote without Jim Crow intimidation. Millions of women worked in blue-collar jobs as well as white-collar jobs and could afford to participate in the consumer economy. The increased availability of birth control devices made it possible for women to have fewer children. And new machines and some technologies like the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner eliminated some of the household work. During the 1920s, many Americans had extra money to spend, and they spent it on consumer goods such as clothes and home appliances like electric refrigerators. In particular, they bought radios. The first commercial radio station in the United States was in Pittsburgh. It was called the KDKA. It hit the airwaves in 1920. 3 years later, there were more than 500 stations in the nation. By the end of the 1920s, there were radios in more than 12 million households. People also went to the movies. Historians eliminate that. By the end of the decades, 3/4 of the American population visited a movie theater every week. But the most important consumer good of the 1920s was the automobile. Low prices and generous credit made cars affordable luxuries at the beginning of the decade. By the end, they were practically necessities. In 1929, there was one car on the road for every 5 Americans. Meanwhile, an economy of automobiles was born. Businesses like service stations and motels sprang up to meet drivers' needs. Cars also gave young people the freedom to go where they pleased and to do what they wanted. What many young people wanted to do was dance. The Charleston, the Cakewalk, the Black Bottom, the Flea Hop. Jazz bands played at venues like the Savoy and the Cotton Club in New York City, in the Oregon in Chicago. Radio stations and phonograph records carried their tunes to listeners across the nation. Some older people objected to jazz music's vulgarity, but many in the younger generation loved the freedom they felt on the dance floor. The novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald narrated the jazz age. During the 1920s, some freedoms were expanded while others were curtailed. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1919, had banned the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors, and at 12 a.m. on January 16, 1920, the Federal Volstead Act closed every tavern, bar, and saloon in the United States. From then on, it was illegal to sell any intoxication beverages with more than 0.5% alcohol. This drove the liquor store trade underground. People simply went to nominally illegal speakeasies instead of ordinary bars, where it was controlled by bootleggers and other organized crime figures such as Chicago gangster Al Capone. To many middle-class white Americans, prohibition was a way to assert some control over the unruly immigrant masses who crowded the nation's cities. For instance, to the so-called dries, beer was known as Kaiser Brew. Drinking was a symbol of all they disliked about the modern city, and eliminating alcohol would, they believed, turn back the clock to an earlier and more comfortable time. Prohibition was not the only source of social tension during the 1920s. An anti-communist Red Scare in 1919 and 1920 encouraged a widespread and anti-immigrant hysteria. This led to the passage of extremely restrictive immigration law, the National Origins Act of 1924, which set immigration quotas and excluded some people in favor of others. Immigrants were hardly the only targets in this decade. The great migration of African Americans from the southern countryside to the northern cities, and the increasingly visibility of black culture, jazz and blues music, for example, and the literary movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, discomfited some white Americans. During this decade, black Americans sought stable employment, better living conditions, and political participation. Many who migrated to the North found jobs in the automobile, steel, shipbuilding, and meatpacking industries. But with more work came more exploitation. In 1925, civil rights activist Philip Randolph founded the first predominantly black labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, to draw attention to the discriminatory hiring practices and working conditions for African Americans. And as the housing demands increased in the North, so did the housing practices that led to the rise of urban ghettos where African Americans were excluded from white neighborhoods and regulated to inadequate, overcrowded, and unsanitary living conditions. Black Americans battled for political and civil rights throughout the Roaring Twenties and beyond. The NAACP launched investigations into the African American disenfranchisement in the 1920 presidential election, as well as surges of white mob violence such as the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. The NAACP also pushed for the passage of the Dreyer anti-lynching bill, a law to make lynching a federal crime, but it was defeated by a Senate filibuster in 1922. A political milestone for black Americans finally occurred when Oscar De Priest, a Chicago Republican, became the first African American congressman since Reconstruction to be elected to the House of Representatives in 1928. The Roaring Twenties ushered in several demographic shifts, or what one historian called a cultural civil war between city dwellers and small-town residents, Protestants and Catholics, blacks and whites, new women, and advocates of old-fashioned family values. I hope you all enjoyed my recap of the Roaring Twenties. Generation Connection appreciates your continued support. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe below. Thank you.